The sound of my father's fist hitting the mahogany dinner table still echoes in my mind 3 months later. You're a disgrace to this family, Nicole. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 28 years old, and what do you have to show for it? A rinky-dink office in some strip mall and delusions of grandeur. The crystal glasses rattled, the expensive china shifted, and my mother's perfectly manicured fingers tightened around her wine stem. That was the night they wrote me off completely. What they didn't know was that my assistant Marcus was already walking up their pristine driveway with an envelope that would change everything. My name is Nicole Martinez, and if you saw me walking down Michigan Avenue 3 months ago, you probably wouldn't have given me a second glance. I was the kind of woman who blended into coffee shop corners, wore the same black blazer 3 days in a row, and carried a leather portfolio that had seen better decades. My dark hair was usually pulled back in a messy bun, not because it was fashionable, but because I didn't have time for anything else. I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment above a pizza place on the north side, where the radiator clanged all night and the neighbors upstairs practiced salsa dancing until 2 in the morning. But that apartment was mine. Every creaky floorboard, every water stain on the ceiling, every dollar of rent came from my own pocket. That mattered to me more than anyone in my family seemed to understand. While my older brother Brandon lived in the guest house of our parents, Winnetka Estate, managing Dad's construction company from his iPhone between golf games, I was building something from nothing. Sure, Martinez Real Estate Investments wasn't much to look at from the outside. The office was squeezed between a nail salon and a tax preparation service in a strip mall off Lincoln Avenue. The carpet was industrial gray, the fluorescent lights buzzed, and the coffee maker made sounds like it was dying a slow death. My staff consisted of exactly 2 people. Marcus Thompson was my assistant, though that title barely covered what he actually did. He was 26, had grown up in Humboldt Park, and possessed the kind of street-smart intelligence that business schools couldn't teach. Marcus could spot a profitable property from 3 blocks away, negotiate with contractors in both English and Spanish, and somehow always knew which permits we needed before I even realized we needed them. Then there was Maria Santos, our receptionist and bookkeeper, who had the magical ability to make our tiny operation sound like a Fortune 500 company when she answered the phone. The work wasn't glamorous. While my family developed luxury condominiums and shopping centers, I focused on forgotten properties. Foreclosed houses in changing neighborhoods, small apartment buildings with absentee landlords, commercial spaces that had been sitting empty for months. I would buy them cheap, renovate them carefully, and either sell them to young families or rent them to small business owners who couldn't afford the fancy districts. It was slow going, but it was honest, and every property I saved felt like a small victory against the decay that seemed to eat at so many Chicago neighborhoods. My family saw it differently. To them, I was playing with toy money while they moved millions. The Martinez Construction Company had been building Chicago for 3 generations. My grandfather started with residential homes after World War II. My father expanded into commercial development during the boom years, and now Brandon was positioning the company for the next wave of downtown growth. They built glass towers, luxury hotels, and shopping complexes that made the skyline magazines. When people drove through certain parts of the city, they were looking at Martinez family legacy. And then there was me, buying run-down 2 flats and arguing with plumbers about pipe installation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The family disappointment. The one who could have had an executive position handed to her but chose to struggle instead. What they never understood was that I hadn't chosen struggle, I had chosen independence. There's a difference, though I had given up trying to explain it. The dinner that changed everything happened on a Tuesday in October. Mom had called 3 times that week, insisting I join them for what she described as a, quote, family business discussion. I should have known something was up. In the Martinez household, family business discussions usually meant someone was about to get lectured, demoted, or cut off entirely. But I went anyway, partly out of curiosity, and partly because I genuinely missed my parents, despite everything. The house I grew up in sat on 2 acres in Winnetka, complete with circular driveway, 3-car garage, and grounds that required a full-time landscaping service. The dining room where we gathered could have seated 12 comfortably, though tonight it was just the 5 of us. Dad at the head of the table in his usual navy suit, even though the workday had ended hours ago. Mom to his right, elegant as always, in a cream silk blouse that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Brandon and his wife Ashley sat across from me, both looking like they had stepped out of a country club catalog. The conversation started pleasantly enough. Dad asked about business, and I made the mistake of answering honestly. I told them about the small apartment complex I had just closed on in Logan Square, how I planned to renovate the units and create affordable housing for working families. I mentioned the community garden I was helping establish in the courtyard, the local artist I had commissioned to paint a mural on the building's east wall. "How much did you pay for it?" Brandon asked, cutting his steak with surgical precision. $230,000, I said, immediately regretting the honesty. Ashley nearly choked on her wine. "For the whole building?" "It needed work," I explained. "The previous owner had let it deteriorate, but the bones are solid. Good neighborhood, near public transportation, walking distance to schools and shopping." "Nicole," Dad said, setting down his fork. "We spent more than that on bathroom fixtures for the Millennium Park project." And that's when the evening started its downward spiral. What followed was a 20-minute dissertation on everything I was doing wrong with my life. I was thinking too small. I was wasting my education. I was embarrassing the family name by operating out of a strip mall. I was 28 years old with nothing significant to show for it. Other people my age were buying houses in Lincoln Park and driving cars that didn't require prayer before starting. "She's playing pretend," Ashley said, twirling her wedding ring around her finger. "Like when we were kids and she would set up a lemonade stand, except now she thinks it's a real business." Brandon laughed. Actually laughed. "Remember when she wanted to be an architect? Then it was interior design, then photography, now this. She's still trying to figure out what she wants to be when she grows up." I sat there listening to them dissect my life like it was a failed science experiment. Mom tried to soften the blows by suggesting I could still come work for the family company, start in project management, work my way up. Dad was more direct. He offered to buy me out, pay off any debts I had accumulated, set me up in a nice condo, and help me find a real job with one of his connections. "You're fighting a losing battle, sweetheart," he said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I remembered from childhood lectures. "Real estate development isn't for amateurs. You need capital, connections, experience. You need to understand how this city really works." That's when he hit the table. That's when the glasses rattled and my world shifted on its axis. "You're a disgrace to this family, Nicole. 28 years old, and what do you have to show for it? A rinky-dink office in some strip mall and delusions of grandeur." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking away the seconds, the distant hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen, the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Ashley was staring at her plate like it held the secrets of the universe. Brandon was nodding slowly, as if Dad had just confirmed something he had been thinking for years. Mom reached across the table and patted my hand in that way that was supposed to be comforting but felt more like a consolation prize. "We love you, honey," she said softly. "We just want what's best for you." I stood up from that table feeling like I was moving underwater. Everything seemed slow and muffled and strange. I thanked them for dinner, kissed Mom's cheek, and walked out of that house with my dignity barely intact. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of streetlights and radio static, and the kind of hurt that settles deep in your chest and refuses to leave. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that while I was driving home through tears and rage and disappointment, Marcus was already in motion. He had been working late at the office, preparing documents for a closing we had scheduled for the following week, when his phone rang. The caller was Jennifer Walsh, a real estate agent who had become something of an unofficial partner over the past year. Jennifer specialized in high-end properties, the kind of deals that made headlines and commission checks with lots of zeros. "Marcus," she said, and he could hear the excitement in her voice even through the phone's crackling connection. I need to talk to Nicole immediately. How fast can you get her on the phone? She's at a family dinner, Marcus replied, glancing at the clock. Probably won't be available for another hour or two. What's going on? The Riverside Commons project, Jennifer said. It's falling apart. The developers just pulled out. Something about financing issues and permit problems. The property is going back on the market tomorrow morning, and I have it on good authority that there's going to be a fire sale. Marcus stopped typing and gave Jennifer his full attention. Riverside Commons was a luxury residential development that had been in the works for 2 years. 48 units, lakefront location, pre-sold to young professionals who were paying premium prices for the privilege of living in one of Chicago's most desirable neighborhoods. The project had been featured in architectural magazines, highlighted in the Tribune's real estate section, and held up as an example of sustainable urban development. How big of a fire sale are we talking about? Marcus asked. Try $12 million for the entire project. That's the land, the permits, the architectural plans, the pre-sales contracts, everything. The original investment was closer to $30 million. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. $12 million was more money than their little company had ever dealt with, but it wasn't impossible. Not if they moved fast, found the right investors, structured the deal correctly. This was the kind of opportunity that could transform Martinez real estate investments from a small neighborhood operation into a legitimate player in the Chicago development scene. Jennifer, he said slowly, if someone were to pick up this project, what kind of timeline are we looking at? Construction was about 60% complete when everything stopped. With the right team, the right financing, and a little bit of luck, someone could have residents moving in by spring. The pre-sales contracts are all still valid, which means immediate cash flow once the units are finished. Marcus was already reaching for his jacket. I'll call Nicole now. Can you meet us at the office in an hour? But when he tried calling me, my phone went straight to voicemail. So he made a decision that would change everything. He called Jennifer back, told her to prepare all the documentation she could find, and asked for the address of the property. Then he grabbed the spare keys to my car, drove to Riverside Commons, and spent 2 hours walking through the half-finished building with a flashlight and a measuring tape. What he found was exactly what Jennifer had described. The developer had run out of money at the worst possible time, with most of the infrastructure complete but none of the finishing work done. The units had good bones, excellent views, and solid construction. More importantly, they were in a neighborhood that was rapidly becoming one of the most sought-after areas in the city. With the right renovation approach, the right marketing strategy, and the right timeline, this could be not just profitable but transformational. By the time I got home from that disastrous family dinner, Marcus was sitting on my front steps with a manila envelope, thick enough to use as a weapon, and an expression on his face that I had never seen before. It was past 10 o'clock, the pizza place downstairs was closed, and the October wind was cutting through the trees like a knife. Nicole, he said, standing up as I approached. We need to talk. I was still raw from dinner, still feeling like I had been emotionally dismantled and left for dead. The last thing I wanted was to discuss work, especially if it involved more problems or complications that I would have to solve with resources I didn't have. Can it wait until tomorrow? I asked, fumbling with my keys. It's been a really long night. No, Marcus said firmly. It can't wait. Trust me. Something in his voice made me stop and really look at him. In the 2 years we had worked together, I had never seen Marcus this focused, this intense. He was practically vibrating with energy, like he had been drinking espresso for hours and could barely contain himself. What's going on? I asked, finally getting the door open. I'm about to show you how to buy the building your family probably wishes they owned, he said, following me up the stairs to my apartment. 20 minutes later, I was sitting at my kitchen table, surrounded by photographs, financial documents, property reports, and architectural plans, trying to process what Marcus was telling me. The Riverside Commons project wasn't just available. It was available at a price that made it almost impossible to ignore, from a seller who was desperate enough to close quickly, in a market that was perfectly positioned for exactly this kind of opportunity. The numbers work, Marcus said, spreading another set of documents across the table. I ran them 3 times. Even if we factor in construction delays, cost overruns, and a conservative selling price, we're looking at a potential profit of $8 to $10 million. I stared at the papers until the numbers started to blur together. Marcus, I said slowly, we don't have $12 million. No, he agreed, but we know people who do. And more importantly, we know this business better than anyone thinks we do. He pulled out his phone and showed me a list of contacts he had compiled over the past few hours. Private investors who had worked with us on smaller projects, business owners who had been looking for new opportunities, even a few contractors who had enough cash to buy into something bigger than their usual jobs. I've already made some calls, Marcus said. Preliminary calls, just to test the waters. Nicole, there are people who would invest in this project based on our track record alone. They've seen what we can do with small properties. They know we finish on time, stay under budget, and deliver quality work. I walked to the window and looked out at the city skyline, trying to imagine myself as the kind of person who made $12 million decisions. 3 hours ago, my family had written me off as a failure who was playing with toy money. Now Marcus was suggesting we make a move that would dwarf anything my father's company had done in recent memory. What if we fail? I asked. What if we don't? Marcus replied. The next morning, I woke up with Marcus's words still echoing in my head, and a stack of documents on my kitchen counter that felt like they might contain either my salvation or my complete destruction. I had barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling and running numbers in my head until they became meaningless sequences of digits floating through my consciousness. By 6 a.m., I was already dressed and making coffee that could strip paint, preparing for what I knew would be the most important day of my professional life. Marcus arrived at the office before I did, which shouldn't have surprised me but somehow did anyway. When I pushed through the glass door of Martinez Real Estate Investments, he was already on the phone, his desk covered with more papers than I had ever seen in our small space. Maria wasn't due in for another hour, so the office felt strangely quiet, except for Marcus's voice and the persistent hum of our ancient air conditioning unit. Yes, sir, I understand the timeline, he was saying into the phone. We're prepared to move quickly on this. Can we schedule a meeting for later today? He looked up when he saw me, held up one finger, and continued the conversation. Perfect. 2 o'clock works. We'll have all the documentation ready. I poured myself another cup of coffee and waited for him to finish. When he finally hung up, he turned to me with an expression that was equal parts excitement and terror. That was David Chen, he said. He owns 3 restaurants in Chinatown and has been looking for investment opportunities outside the food industry. He's interested in hearing our proposal. David Chen was one of our previous clients, though on a much smaller scale. We had helped him purchase a small building for his 3rd restaurant location, and the project had gone so smoothly that he had referred 2 other business owners to us. He was exactly the kind of investor Marcus had been talking about the night before, someone who knew our work and trusted our judgment. How much is he thinking? I asked. $2 million, Marcus replied. Maybe more if he likes what he hears. $2 million was significant, but it was still only a fraction of what we needed. I spent the next hour making my own phone calls, reaching out to contacts I had cultivated over the past 3 years. There was Robert Kim, who owned a chain of dry cleaning stores and had mentioned wanting to diversify his investments. Sarah Williams, a retired teacher who had inherited money from her parents and was looking for something more profitable than savings accounts. Even Tom Bradley, a contractor who had worked on several of our renovation projects and had expressed interest in getting involved on the business side. By noon, we had tentative commitments for almost $6 million. It wasn't enough, but it was close enough to make the project feel possible rather than impossible. The catch was that everyone wanted to see detailed financial projections, construction timelines, and market analysis before they would commit to anything concrete. We had roughly 4 hours to put together a presentation that would either secure our future or confirm my family's assessment of my capabilities. We need Jennifer here, I told Marcus. And we need her now. Jennifer Walsh arrived at our office carrying a briefcase that looked like it cost more than my monthly rent and wearing a confidence that I envied. She was one of those women who could walk into any room and immediately command attention, not because she was loud or aggressive, but because she possessed an unshakable certainty about her own competence. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her navy suit was expertly tailored, and her handshake was firm enough to crush walnuts. "I've been thinking about this project all night," she said, settling into one of our mismatched chairs. "And I think we're looking at this from the wrong angle." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a tablet loaded with photographs, market data, and financial projections that made our morning's work look amateur by comparison. For the next 2 hours, she walked us through every aspect of the Riverside Commons opportunity, from the original development plans to the current market conditions that made this the perfect time to complete the project. The previous developers made one critical mistake, Jennifer explained, scrolling through images of the half-finished building. They focused on luxury amenities instead of practical value. Granted, countertops and imported fixtures are nice, but what people actually want is space, light, and location. This building has all three in abundance. She showed us comparable sales in the neighborhood, rental rates for similar properties, and demographic data that painted a clear picture of the target market. Young professionals who worked downtown but wanted to live near the lake. Small families who were priced out of Lincoln Park but still wanted access to good schools and public transportation. Empty nesters who were ready to downsize from suburban houses but weren't willing to compromise on quality. "If we finish these units correctly," Jennifer continued, focusing on modern functionality rather than ostentatious luxury, we can price them competitively while maintaining healthy profit margins. The pre-sales contracts are already locked in at premium prices, but even if we had to start from scratch, the market conditions are perfect. Marcus was taking notes as fast as he could write, asking questions about construction costs, permit requirements, and marketing strategies. I found myself getting caught up in Jennifer's enthusiasm, starting to see the project not as an impossible dream, but as a complex puzzle that we might actually be able to solve. "There's something else," Jennifer said, lowering her voice slightly. "I know why the original developers really pulled out, and it wasn't just financing." She explained that the previous development company had been involved in several projects that were now under investigation by the city's building inspection department. Nothing criminal, but enough regulatory problems to make their investors nervous. The Riverside Commons project had become collateral damage, abandoned not because it wasn't viable, but because the developers needed to focus their resources on protecting their other investments. "Which means," Jennifer said, "that anyone who picks up this project is getting a clean slate. No regulatory baggage, no inspector grudges, no bureaucratic complications. It's actually a better situation than starting from scratch." By the time our first investor meeting rolled around at 2 o'clock, we had assembled a presentation that looked professional enough to belong in a downtown conference room. David Chen arrived precisely on time, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the kind of serious expression that suggested he took this opportunity as seriously as we did. "I've been following your work for the past year," he said, settling into our small conference area. "The restaurant building project was exactly what you promised, delivered when you said it would be, for the price you quoted. That's rare in this business." We walked him through the Riverside Commons opportunity, starting with the financial projections and moving through construction timelines, market analysis, and profit potential. David asked intelligent questions about everything from property taxes to insurance costs, taking notes in a small leather notebook that he consulted frequently. "The numbers look good," he said finally. "But I have one concern. This is a much larger project than anything you've handled before. How do I know you can manage something of this scale?" It was a fair question, and one that I had been asking myself since Marcus first showed me the documents. I looked at him, then at Jennifer, then back at David, and realized that this was the moment where I either convinced him or lost him entirely. "You're right," I said. "This is bigger than anything we've done before. But that's exactly why it's going to work. The previous developers failed because they thought size meant they could cut corners, ignore details, treat this like just another project on their assembly line. We don't have that luxury, and we don't want it." I stood up and walked to the window. looking out at the strip mall parking lot where our office sat like a small island of ambition surrounded by nail salons and tax preparation services. Every project we've completed has been personal to us, I continued. We know the contractors personally. We inspect every detail ourselves. We're invested in the Basabichet outcome because our reputation depends on it. That doesn't change just because the numbers get bigger. If anything, it becomes more important. David listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making notes. When I finished, he closed his notebook and looked directly at me. I'm in for $2.5 million, he said. But I want monthly progress reports and the right to inspect the work at any time. After David left, we had barely enough time to celebrate before our next appointment arrived. Sarah Williams, the retired teacher, was nothing like what I had expected. Instead of the cautious, conservative investor I had imagined, she turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman in her early 60s, who asked more penetrating questions than David had, and took copious notes on everything from market projections to construction materials. I didn't spend 40 years teaching high school mathematics to be fooled by fuzzy numbers, she said when we showed her our financial projections. These look solid, but I want to understand exactly how you arrived at these construction cost estimates. Marcus walked her through every line item, from foundation work to finished carpentry, explaining how we had calculated costs based on current market rates and our experience with similar projects. Sarah listened carefully, occasionally asking for clarification or requesting additional detail about specific aspects of the renovation work. I'm impressed, she said finally. Most investment presentations I've seen rely on optimism and wishful thinking. This feels like actual planning. She committed to $1.5 million, bringing our total to $4 million and making the project feel increasingly real rather than theoretical. We had 3 more meetings scheduled for the rest of the week, and if they went as well as the first 2, we might actually be able to put together the financing we needed. But that evening, as I was locking up the office and preparing to head home, my phone rang. The caller ID showed my mother's number, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready for another conversation about my life choices or my family's disappointment in my career trajectory. Hi, Mom, I said, answering on the 4th ring. Nicole, honey, I wanted to apologize for last night. Your father was under a lot of stress, and I think he said some things he didn't mean. I walked to my car slowly, trying to figure out how to respond. Part of me wanted to tell her about the Riverside Commons project, about the investors who were taking us seriously, about the possibility that we might be on the verge of something significant. But another part of me wasn't ready to share that information, especially not with family members who had made their opinion of my capabilities clear. It's okay, Mom, I said finally. I understand he's frustrated. He loves you, you know. We all do. We just worry that you're making things harder for yourself than they need to be. I know, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it anymore. Maybe you could come to dinner again next week? I'm making that lasagna you used to love when you were little. I promised to think about it, though I had no intention of subjecting myself to another evening of criticism disguised as concern. After I hung up, I sat in my car for several minutes, watching people walk past on the sidewalk and thinking about how dramatically my life might be about to change. The next morning brought both good news and complications. Tom Bradley, the contractor, was definitely interested in investing, but he wanted to be involved in the actual construction work as well. Robert Kim was ready to commit $3 million, but only if we could guarantee that construction would be completed within 6 months. And Jennifer had discovered that there was another potential buyer circling the Riverside Commons project, which meant we needed to move faster than originally planned. How much faster? I asked, sitting across from Jennifer in a downtown coffee shop that served espresso strong enough to wake the dead. The seller wants a decision by Friday, she said, which gives us exactly 3 days to finalize our financing and submit a formal offer. 3 days felt both impossibly short and perfectly reasonable. We had enough investor commitments to make the project viable, but we still needed to coordinate the legal documentation, arrange for inspections, and negotiate the final terms of the purchase agreement. More importantly, we needed to make sure that everyone involved understood exactly what they were signing up for. There's something else, Jennifer said, lowering her voice even though the coffee shop was nearly empty. I found out who the other potential buyer is. She pulled out her phone and showed me a news article from the Tribune's business section. The headline read, "Martinez Construction expands portfolio with luxury residential acquisition." Below it was a photograph of my father and Brandon, both wearing hard hats and standing in front of a partially completed building that looked suspiciously familiar. "They're going after the same project?" I asked, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. "It looks that way," Jennifer replied, "though they're probably approaching it from a completely different angle. Your family's company has the kind of resources that would let them close quickly, without needing to coordinate multiple investors or worry about financing timelines." I stared at the photograph, trying to process what this meant. My family had spent Tuesday evening explaining why I was a failure, why my business was a joke, why I would never amount to anything significant in the real estate world. Now, less than a week later, they were pursuing the exact same opportunity that we were working toward, probably without even knowing that I was involved. "Does this change anything?" Jennifer asked. I thought about it for a long moment, considering the implications. If my family's company submitted an offer, they would almost certainly be able to outbid us. They had access to capital that we couldn't match, established relationships with banks and investors that would make financing trivial, and a reputation that would give sellers confidence in their ability to close quickly. On the other hand, we had something they didn't. We had spent the past week studying every aspect of this project, understanding the market conditions, developing relationships with the people involved. We knew exactly how much the renovation would cost, how long it would take, and what the finished units would be worth. Most importantly, we cared about the outcome in a way that a large construction company might not. "No," I said finally, "this doesn't change anything. If anything, it makes me more determined to make this work." That afternoon, Marcus and I spent 3 hours in conference calls with our potential investors, finalizing the terms of their participation and coordinating the legal documentation we would need to submit our offer. By evening, we had commitments totaling $11.7 million, just enough to make a competitive bid with a small buffer for unexpected costs. The only problem was that Robert Kim had changed his mind about the timeline. Instead of 6 months, he now wanted a guarantee that construction would be completed within 4 months. And he wanted penalty clauses written into our agreement that would cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars if we ran behind schedule. "4 months is aggressive," Marcus said, reviewing the construction timeline we had developed with our contractor contacts. "Not impossible, but aggressive." "What happens if we say no?" I asked. "We lose $3 million in financing and probably can't make a competitive offer. And if we say yes but can't deliver on time? We lose money we don't have and probably destroy our reputation in the process." I looked around our small office, at the mismatched furniture and buzzing fluorescent lights and industrial gray carpet that had seen better decades. In 48 hours, we would either submit an offer that could transform our business into something significant, or we would remain exactly what we had always been, a small neighborhood operation that helped people buy and renovate modest properties. "Call Robert Kim," I said. "Tell him we'll take the 4-month timeline, but we want to renegotiate the penalty structure. Instead of financial penalties for delays, we'll give him a larger percentage of the profits if we finish early." Marcus raised his eyebrows. "That's risky." "Everything about this is risky," I replied, "but it's also the best opportunity we're ever likely to see." By Thursday evening, we had all the pieces in place. Our investors were committed, our financing was arranged, our legal team had prepared the necessary documentation, and Jennifer had scheduled the formal presentation for Friday morning. All that remained was to survive one more night of anxiety and self-doubt before finding out whether we could actually pull off something this ambitious. I was at home, reviewing our presentation materials for what felt like the 100th time, when my phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed Brandon's number, which was unusual enough to make me answer immediately. "Hey, Nicole," he said, and something in his voice sounded different than usual. Less condescending, more uncertain. "I wanted to talk to you about something." "What's going on?" I asked, setting down the financial projections I had been studying. "I heard through some industry contacts that you might be involved in a bid for the Riverside Commons project. Is that true?" For a moment I considered lying or deflecting, but I was too tired for games. Yes, it's true. We're submitting an offer tomorrow morning. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Nicole, you know Dad's company is looking at the same project, right? I figured that out, I said. Does that bother you? It's not about being bothered, Brandon replied. It's about being realistic. This is a $12 million project. Even if you could put together the financing, do you really think you can manage something of this scale? I felt something familiar rising in my chest. The same mixture of frustration and determination that had been building since Tuesday's dinner. You know what, Brandon? 3 days ago, you and Dad and Ashley spent an entire evening explaining why I'm a failure. Now you're calling to question whether I can handle a project that your company apparently thinks is worth pursuing. That's not what I meant. Yes, it is exactly what you meant, I interrupted. And for the record, yes, I think we can handle it. We've been preparing for this opportunity for months. We understand the market better than anyone, and we have the right team in place to execute the project successfully. Nicole, listen to me. Dad doesn't know I'm calling you, but I think you should know that he's planning to submit an offer for $15 million. Cash, no financing contingencies, 30-day close. You can't compete with that. I felt something shift inside me, a clarity that cut through all the doubt and uncertainty I had been carrying. Maybe not, I said. But I'm going to try anyway. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about what Brandon had told me and what it meant for our chances. $15 million was more than we could offer, and a cash deal with no contingencies was exactly the kind of offer that sellers dreamed about. By any rational analysis, we were about to walk into a meeting where we would be immediately outbid by my own family's company. But something about that realization was oddly liberating. For 3 years, I had been building my business carefully, conservatively, making safe decisions and modest investments that gradually established our reputation and financial stability. Tomorrow, I was going to find out what happened when I bet everything on a single opportunity, when I stopped playing it safe and started playing to win. I called Marcus and told him about Brandon's warning. He listened without interrupting, asked a few questions about the details, and then was quiet for almost a minute. So what do you want to do? He asked finally. I want to walk into that meeting tomorrow morning and make the best presentation of our lives, I said. And then I want to find out whether we're as good as we think we are. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel sharp and electric. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror at 5:30 a.m., trying to decide between the navy suit that made me look serious or the charcoal gray one that made me feel confident. I settled on the gray, paired with a white blouse and the one pair of expensive shoes I owned, black leather pumps that I had bought for my college graduation and saved for special occasions ever since. Marcus picked me up at 7, carrying 2 large coffee cups and wearing a suit I had never seen before. He looked nervous, which was unusual for him, but also determined in a way that reminded me why I had hired him in the first place. We drove to the downtown office building where our meeting was scheduled, listening to morning radio and reviewing our presentation notes one final time. Remember, Marcus said as we pulled into the parking garage, we're not just competing on price. We're competing on vision, execution capability, and understanding of what this project could become. Jennifer was waiting for us in the lobby, looking like she had stepped out of a business magazine. Her briefcase was perfectly organized, her presentation materials were immaculate, and her confidence seemed unshakable. Together, the 3 of us took the elevator to the 32nd floor, where the law offices of Williams, Peterson & Associates occupied a suite of rooms with floor-to-ceiling windows and views that stretched across the entire city. The conference room where our meeting was scheduled felt like something from a corporate movie set. Mahogany table, leather chairs, and walls lined with law books that probably cost more than most people's cars. At the head of the table sat Thomas Riverside, the seller's representative, a man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of expensive watch that suggested he had been making deals like this for most of his adult life. Ms. Martinez, he said, standing to shake my hand. I've heard interesting things about your company. I understand you've been making quite an impression in the residential renovation market. We spent the first few minutes on pleasantries and introductions, but I could tell that Thomas was studying us carefully, trying to determine whether we were serious contenders or just another group of optimistic investors who didn't understand the complexity of what they were proposing. When we finally got down to business, I felt like we were being tested on every word we said. Jennifer handled the market analysis portion of our presentation, walking through demographic data, comparable sales, and rental rate projections with the kind of precision that made it clear she had done her homework. She explained why the previous developers had failed, not because the project was flawed, but because they had misunderstood their target market and over-engineered the amenities. The buyers who have already signed pre-sales contracts aren't looking for marble countertops and imported fixtures, she explained, clicking through slides that showed unit layouts and finishing options. They want space, natural light, modern functionality, and a location that gives them access to both downtown employment and lakefront recreation. This building can deliver all of that at a competitive price point. Marcus followed with the construction timeline and budget analysis, breaking down every aspect of the renovation work and explaining how we had calculated costs based on current market rates and our relationships with local contractors. He showed photographs of similar projects we had completed, provided references from previous clients, and walked through quality control procedures that would ensure the work was completed on schedule and within budget. The key advantage of our approach, Marcus said, is that we know these contractors personally. We've worked with them before, we understand their capabilities and limitations, and we have the kind of relationships that make it possible to coordinate complex projects efficiently. Then it was my turn to present the financial structure and explain how we had assembled the investment group that would fund the project. I walked through our investor commitments, showing how each participant brought not just money but also specific expertise that would contribute to the project's success. David Chen's experience in hospitality and customer service, Sarah Williams's background in education and community development, Tom Bradley's construction knowledge and quality control standards. What we're offering, I said, looking directly at Thomas, isn't just financial resources. It's a team of people who are personally invested in making this project successful, who understand the local market, and who have the flexibility to adapt to changing conditions without getting bogged down in corporate bureaucracy. Thomas listened to our entire presentation without interrupting, taking occasional notes and asking clarifying questions about timeline details and financial projections. When we finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied the documents we had provided for several minutes. "Impressive work," he said finally. "You've clearly done your research and assembled a credible financing package. I have to ask, though, are you aware that there's another bidder for this property?" "We're aware," I replied, "and we understand that they might be able to offer more money up front. But we believe our approach offers advantages that go beyond the purchase price." "Such as?" I took a breath and decided to be completely honest. "The other bidder is Martinez Construction, which happens to be my family's company. They're a large, established firm with access to significant capital and extensive experience in commercial development. What they don't have is personal investment in this specific project, or a detailed understanding of this particular market segment." Thomas raised his eyebrows slightly. "Your family's company?" "That's correct. And while they could certainly complete this project successfully, I don't think they would bring the same level of attention to detail or commitment to community integration that we're proposing." We spent another 30 minutes discussing contract terms, closing timelines, and contingency structures. Thomas explained that he would be reviewing all proposals over the weekend and making a recommendation to his client by Monday morning. He walked us to the elevator, shook hands with each of us, and promised to be in touch soon. As we rode down to the parking garage, none of us said much. The presentation had gone well, but we all understood that our fate was now completely out of our hands. Either our approach would resonate with the seller, or my family's superior financial resources would carry the day. "I think we did everything we could," Jennifer said as we reached our cars. "Now we just have to wait and see." The weekend that followed was one of the longest of my life. I tried to stay busy with routine office work, catching up on paperwork for other projects and returning calls from potential clients. But my mind kept drifting back to the Riverside Commons presentation and what Thomas might be thinking as he reviewed our proposal alongside my family's competing offer. Saturday afternoon, I was organizing files in the office when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Ashley's number, which was unusual enough to make me answer immediately. "Nicole, hi." she said, sounding oddly tentative. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Just catching up on some paperwork, I replied. What's going on? I wanted to talk to you about something that happened at dinner last night. Something involving your business. I felt my stomach tighten. What about my business? Well, Robert was telling us about this project his company is bidding on, some luxury residential development that another firm had to abandon. He was really excited about it, talking about how it could be a signature project for Martinez Construction. Ashley paused, and I could hear voices in the background, as if she was calling from a restaurant or coffee shop. The thing is, she continued, when he was describing the project, the location, the timeline, it sounded exactly like something you had mentioned before. That building you drove me past a few months ago when we were looking at apartments in that neighborhood. My heart started beating faster. What exactly did he say? He said the previous developers had run into financial problems and the project was going back on the market. He seemed to think it was a perfect opportunity for the company to expand into luxury residential work. But Nicole, if this is the same project you're involved with, I thought you should know that he's planning to submit a much higher offer than what you mentioned the other night. I thanked Ashley for calling and promised to think about what she had told me, though I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do with the information. My family's company was pursuing the same opportunity with significantly more resources than we could muster. That much I already knew. What Ashley's call confirmed was that they had no idea I was involved, which meant they were making their decision based purely on business considerations, rather than any desire to compete with me personally. Somehow, that made it both better and worse. Better because it meant Tuesday's dinner conversation hadn't been motivated by knowledge of my plans. Worse because it meant they truly didn't consider me enough of a factor in the Chicago real estate market to even be aware of my activities. Sunday passed in a haze of anxiety and second-guessing. I found myself alternately convinced that our presentation had been brilliant and certain that we had missed some crucial element that would cost us the deal. By evening, I was exhausted from overthinking every aspect of the situation and decided to go for a walk along the lakefront to clear my head. The October air was cool and sharp, and the lake stretched out like a dark mirror reflecting the city lights. I walked for almost an hour, past couples holding hands and families with small children, past joggers and dog walkers and other people who seemed to have their lives figured out in ways that I envied. When I finally turned around and headed home, I felt calmer but no less uncertain about what Monday would bring. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that made everything feel muted and uncertain. I was at the office by 7:30, earlier than usual, trying to keep busy with routine tasks while waiting for some word from Thomas Riverside. Marcus arrived shortly after 8, carrying coffee and wearing an expression that suggested he had slept about as well as I had. "Any word yet?" he asked, settling at his desk. "Nothing," I replied. Thomas said he would make his recommendation this morning, but he didn't specify when. We spent the morning working on other projects, returning calls to potential clients, and reviewing documents for a small apartment building renovation we had scheduled to begin the following week. It was the kind of routine work that normally felt comfortable and manageable, but today it seemed insignificant compared to the opportunity that might be slipping away from us. At 11:15, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something about it looked familiar. "Nicole Martinez," I answered. "Ms. Martinez, this is Thomas Riverside. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" My heart started pounding so hard, I was afraid he might hear it through the phone. "Of course. I've spent the weekend reviewing both proposals for the Riverside Commons project, and I have to say, it was a difficult decision. Both offers have significant merits." I sat down slowly, trying to prepare myself for disappointment while holding on to a small thread of hope. "However," Thomas continued, "after careful consideration, my client has decided to accept your proposal." For a moment, I wasn't sure I had heard him correctly. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" "Your proposal has been accepted. My client was impressed by your understanding of the market, your detailed renovation plans, and particularly your commitment to maintaining the community character of the neighborhood. The higher cash offer from Martinez Construction was tempting, but ultimately your approach aligned better with his vision for the property." I looked across the office at Marcus, who was watching me with an expression of intense curiosity. I gave him a thumbs up, and his face broke into a grin that could have powered the building. "That's wonderful news," I managed to say. "What are the next steps?" Thomas explained that we would need to finalize the purchase agreement within 48 hours, coordinate inspections and due diligence procedures, and arrange for the closing to take place within 2 weeks. It was an aggressive timeline, but exactly what we had prepared for. After I hung up, Marcus and I sat in our small office for several minutes, looking at each other and trying to process what had just happened. 3 months ago, my family had dismissed me as a failure who was playing with toy money. This morning, we had secured a $12 million development project that would transform our business and establish us as legitimate players in the Chicago real estate market. "We actually did it," Marcus said finally. "We actually did it." I agreed. But even as we celebrated, I knew that the real work was just beginning. We had 2 weeks to finalize the purchase, coordinate our investor agreements, and begin the complex process of managing a construction project unlike anything we had ever attempted. More importantly, we had to do it all while maintaining the quality standards and attention to detail that had convinced Thomas to choose us over my family's company. The rest of Monday passed in a blur of phone calls, legal documents, and planning meetings. Jennifer arrived at the office with a bottle of champagne and a stack of contracts that needed to be reviewed and signed. Our investors began transferring funds and finalizing their participation agreements. Tom Bradley started coordinating with subcontractors and scheduling the preliminary work that would need to begin as soon as we officially took possession of the property. By evening, the reality of what we had committed to was starting to sink in. We had exactly 4 months to complete a renovation project that would either establish our reputation as serious developers or destroy our business entirely. There was no middle ground, no room for significant mistakes, and no opportunity to learn as we went along. But as I locked up the office that night and walked to my car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine excitement about the future. For the first time since that disastrous family dinner, I was looking forward to proving what I was capable of accomplishing. The closing took place on a Thursday morning in November, in the same downtown law office, where we had made our presentation 2 weeks earlier. I sat at that polished mahogany table, surrounded by lawyers, investors, and stacks of documents that represented the largest financial transaction of my life, trying to maintain the composure of someone who did this sort of thing regularly. When Thomas Riverside slid the final set of papers across the table for my signature, my hand was steadier than I had expected it to be. "Congratulations, Ms. Martinez," he said as I signed the last document. "You are now the owner of the Riverside Commons development project." Walking out of that building with the keys to a $12 million property felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life. Marcus was practically vibrating with excitement, Jennifer was already on her phone coordinating marketing strategies, and I was trying to process the fact that we had actually pulled off something that had seemed impossible just a month earlier. But the euphoria lasted exactly as long as it took us to drive to the property and walk through the half-finished building for the first time as owners rather than prospective buyers. Standing in the empty lobby, surrounded by exposed wiring and unfinished drywall, the magnitude of what we had committed to became crystal clear. We had 48 luxury residential units to complete, a 4-month deadline that was already starting to feel optimistic, and investors who were expecting regular progress reports and eventual profits. "Okay," I said, looking around at the controlled chaos of an interrupted construction site. "Where do we start?" Tom Bradley, our lead contractor, had been waiting for us with a crew of workers and a detailed timeline that he had been refining since our first conversation about the project. He was a man in his early 50s who had been building things in Chicago for most of his adult life, and he possessed the kind of practical wisdom that only comes from decades of turning architectural plans into actual structures that people could live in. "First thing we need to do is assess exactly what the previous contractors finished and what they left undone," Tom said, consulting a clipboard thick with notes and sketches. "Then we prioritize the work based on what needs to happen in sequence and what can be done simultaneously." We spent the rest of Thursday and most of Friday walking through every unit, cataloging what had been completed, and identifying what still needed to be done. The previous developers had finished most of the structural work, including plumbing and electrical systems. But they had barely started on the finishing details that would transform these spaces from construction sites into homes where people would actually want to live. The units themselves were impressive, with high ceilings, large windows, and open floor plans that maximized both space and natural light. The building's location offered views of both the downtown skyline and the lake, and the neighborhood had the kind of walkable charm that young professionals and small families were increasingly seeking. But every unit needed flooring, paint, kitchen cabinets, bathroom fixtures, and dozens of other details that would determine whether the finished product felt like luxury housing or expensive disappointment. The good news, Tom explained as we stood in what would eventually become a 2-bedroom unit with lake views, is that the infrastructure is solid. Good bones, quality materials, no shortcuts that we'll need to fix later. The challenge is going to be coordinating all the finish work without creating bottlenecks that slow down the overall timeline. He showed me his preliminary schedule, a complex chart that looked like it belonged in a NASA mission control room. Flooring installers would work on the lower floors while painters finished the upper units. Kitchen cabinet installation would happen in phases, allowing appliance delivery and hookup to proceed without waiting for all the carpentry to be completed. Bathroom fixtures would be installed on a rotating schedule that maximized efficiency while ensuring that each unit was finished to the same quality standards. It's ambitious, Tom admitted, but doable if everything goes according to plan. The following Monday, work began in earnest. By 7 a.m., the building was filled with the sounds of construction. Power tools, workers calling instructions to each other, delivery trucks backing up to unload materials. I arrived each morning at 6:30, walking through the units with a checklist and coffee that had gone cold before I remembered to drink it, checking progress and identifying problems before they became serious delays. Marcus had transformed himself into a project coordinator, tracking materials deliveries, managing subcontractor schedules, and maintaining the detailed progress reports that our investors had requested. He seemed to be everywhere at once, consulting with electricians about outlet placement, discussing paint colors with the finishing crew, and somehow keeping track of hundreds of moving parts, without losing his mind or his sense of humor. Jennifer was handling the marketing and sales aspects of the project, working with the buyers who had signed pre-sales contracts, and generating interest from additional potential purchasers. She had created promotional materials that highlighted the building's location, amenities, and community integration features. And she was coordinating with local real estate agents to ensure that we would have a waiting list of qualified buyers for any units that became available. For the first month, everything proceeded exactly according to plan. Units were being completed on schedule, our costs were staying within the budgeted ranges, and our investors were pleased with the progress reports they received each week. I started to think that maybe we actually knew what we were doing, that the project might be completed on time and within budget, and that we might even exceed the profit projections we had presented to our financial partners. Then December arrived, and everything started falling apart at once. The first problem was weather. Chicago winters are notoriously harsh, but December brought a series of storms that made even routine construction work complicated and time-consuming. Deliveries were delayed when trucks couldn't navigate icy roads. Workers had to spend extra time setting up heating equipment to keep materials from freezing. Simple tasks that should have taken hours stretched into full days, as crews dealt with conditions that ranged from merely uncomfortable to genuinely dangerous. The second problem was supply chain issues. The kitchen cabinets we had ordered in October were delayed by manufacturing problems at the supplier's factory. The hardwood flooring we had selected was back-ordered due to increased demand from other construction projects. Even basic materials like paint and electrical fixtures became difficult to obtain as other developers competed for the same resources from the same suppliers. But the third problem was the one that truly tested our ability to manage a project of this complexity. Two of our key subcontractors, companies that Tom had worked with for years and trusted completely, ran into financial difficulties that forced them to pull out of the project with almost no notice. Suddenly, we were scrambling to find replacement crews for both plumbing finish work and tile installation, trying to maintain our timeline while dealing with contractors who didn't know the project specifications and weren't familiar with our quality standards. We're looking at a 6-week delay, minimum, Tom told me during a meeting in what was supposed to become the building's community room. That assumes we can find replacement contractors immediately, and that the new crews can work efficiently without a learning curve. 6 weeks would put us 2 weeks past our promised completion date, and dangerously close to the penalty clauses that Robert Kim had insisted on including in his investment agreement. More importantly, it would push the project into the spring selling season, when competition from other developments would be at its peak and our pre-sales buyers might start looking for alternative options. What if we bring in additional crews? I asked. Double up on some of the work to make up for lost time? Possible, Tom replied, but expensive. We're talking about premium rates for expedited work, overtime costs, and coordination challenges that could actually slow things down if we're not careful. I spent that evening in my apartment, surrounded by project timelines and financial projections, trying to figure out how to keep the Riverside Commons development on track without destroying our profit margins or disappointing our investors. The numbers were starting to look challenging in ways that our original projections hadn't anticipated, and I was beginning to understand why so many construction projects ended up over budget and behind schedule. The next morning I called an emergency meeting with Marcus, Jennifer, and our key investors. We gathered in David Chen's restaurant after closing time, sitting around a table in the back room while David served tea and listened to me explain exactly how complicated our situation had become. The bottom line, I said, is that we can still complete this project successfully, but it's going to require some adjustments to our timeline and budget. We need to decide whether we want to accept delays and stay within our original cost projections, or spend more money to maintain our promised completion date. David was the first to respond. What kind of additional costs are we looking at? Roughly $800,000, Marcus replied, consulting the detailed analysis he had prepared. That would cover premium rates for replacement contractors, overtime costs for accelerated work, and expedited shipping for materials that are currently backordered. Sarah Williams, who had been quietly taking notes throughout the meeting, looked up from her notebook. And what happens to our profit projections if we absorb those additional costs? They're reduced by about 15%, I admitted. Still profitable, but not as attractive as what we originally projected. The room was quiet for several minutes as everyone processed the implications. These people had invested their money based on our promises about timeline and profitability, and now we were asking them to accept either delays or reduced returns. It was exactly the kind of situation that could destroy relationships and reputations, regardless of how the project ultimately turned out. I have a question, Tom Bradley said, leaning forward in his chair. What happens if we do nothing? If we just accept the delays and stay within the original budget, we probably lose the pre-sales buyers who can't wait for spring delivery, Jennifer replied. And we definitely trigger penalty clauses with Robert Kim's investment agreement. Plus, we miss the winter selling season, which means competing with every other development that comes on the market in the spring. So we're talking about a choice between guaranteed additional costs and probable additional losses, David summarized. That's about right, I said. Robert Kim, who had been silent throughout most of the discussion, finally spoke up. Nicole, I want to ask you something directly. Do you still believe this project will be successful? I thought about the question for a moment, considering everything we had learned over the past month about construction timelines, supply chain challenges, and the complexity of managing multiple contractors simultaneously. Then I thought about the units themselves, with their lake views and downtown access, and the kind of thoughtful design that was rare in luxury residential developments. Yes, I said, I believe it will be successful. Not as easy as we originally thought, and not as profitable as we originally projected, but successful. The market demand is real, the location is excellent, and the quality of what we're building is going to exceed what buyers expect at this price point. Then I think we pay the additional costs and stick to the timeline, Robert said. I'd rather have a smaller return on a project that succeeds than a larger return on a project that fails. One by one, the other investors agreed. David nodded his approval, Sarah confirmed her support, and Tom committed to finding the additional crews we would need to accelerate the work. By the end of the evening, we had a revised plan that would keep the project on schedule, while requiring everyone to accept reduced profits in exchange for reduced risk. The next phase of construction proceeded with an intensity that was both exhilarating and exhausting. We had crews working in shifts, with some teams starting at 6 a.m. and others continuing until 10 p.m. The building hummed with activity from dawn until late evening, as workers raced to make up for the time we had lost and to complete the project before winter weather made outdoor work impossible. I was at the site every day, monitoring progress and troubleshooting problems before they could disrupt the overall timeline. Marcus coordinated deliveries and managed the complex logistics of having multiple crews working simultaneously without getting in each other's way. Tom Bradley seemed to be everywhere at once, checking quality standards, resolving disputes between subcontractors, and maintaining the level of craftsmanship that would determine whether our finished product looked like luxury housing or expensive disappointment. The work was demanding, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways that I hadn't anticipated. Watching empty spaces transform into homes where families would live, seeing the careful coordination of dozens of skilled workers, and knowing that we were creating something meaningful and lasting made the long hours and constant stress worthwhile. By the end of January, we were back on schedule. Units were being completed at the rate we had originally projected. Our quality standards were being maintained despite the accelerated timeline, and our pre-sales buyers were expressing satisfaction with the progress they could observe during their scheduled walkthroughs. But success brought its own complications. As word spread about the Riverside Commons development, other real estate professionals began paying attention to our work. Industry publications wrote articles about the small company that had successfully taken over a failed luxury development. Local business magazines featured stories about innovative approaches to residential construction and community integration. And eventually, inevitably, my family found out what I had been doing. The call came on a Tuesday evening in February, just as I was leaving the construction site after a particularly productive day. Units were being finished ahead of schedule, our first wave of buyers was scheduled to move in within weeks, and everything seemed to be proceeding exactly as we had planned. "Nicole," my father said when I answered the phone, "I think we need to talk." His voice was different than I had heard it in months. Not angry or condescending, but careful, like he was choosing his words more thoughtfully than usual. Something in his tone made me stop walking and pay attention in a way that I hadn't during our recent conversations. "What's going on, Dad?" "I saw the article in the Tribune this morning about the Riverside Commons project. About your company." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I had known this conversation would happen eventually, but I had been hoping to postpone it until after the project was completed and our success was undeniable. "Okay," I said carefully. "Nicole, I had no idea. When we were pursuing that same property, I didn't know you were involved. I didn't know you had put together an investment group, or that you were capable of managing something of that scale. Would it have mattered if you had known?" I asked. There was a long pause. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe, probably. The truth is, I underestimated you. We all did." I wasn't sure how to respond to that admission. Part of me wanted to point out that his underestimation had motivated me to prove him wrong. Another part of me just wanted to move past the family dynamics and focus on the work that still needed to be completed. "The project is going well," I said. "We should have the first units ready for occupancy next month." "I can see that," Dad replied. "Nicole, I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've accomplished. And I'm sorry for what I said at dinner that night. You're not a failure. You never were." After I hung up, I sat in my car for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. My father, who had spent months dismissing my business as a joke, had just acknowledged that he had been wrong about my capabilities. It was the kind of validation I had been seeking for years, but now that I had it, it felt less important than I had expected. What mattered more was the work itself, the knowledge that we had taken on an impossible challenge and found a way to make it succeed. Tomorrow, I would return to the construction site and continue the process of transforming empty spaces into homes. Next month, families would start moving into units that we had renovated with care and attention to detail, and somewhere in the future, other developers would look at the Riverside Commons project and understand that small companies with big ambitions could accomplish things that surprised everyone, including themselves. March arrived with the kind of warmth that made Chicago residents remember why they endured the winter. The Riverside Commons project was not just completed but thriving, with 46 of our 48 units occupied by families who had fallen in love with the combination of downtown accessibility and lakefront living that we had promised. The 2 remaining units had multiple offers, and Jennifer was managing a waiting list of potential buyers who hoped something else might become available. Standing in the building's lobby on a sunny Thursday morning, watching residents head off to work and children play in the courtyard garden we had installed, I felt something I had never experienced before: the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I had built something lasting and meaningful. These weren't just profitable transactions or successful investments. They were homes where real people were creating real lives, and we had made that possible. Marcus walked up beside me, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the new cafe that had opened across the street, partly because our development had brought enough foot traffic to the neighborhood to support small businesses. "The final numbers came in," he said, handing me one of the cups. "After all expenses, investor returns, and contractor bonuses, we cleared just over $3 million in profit." $3 million was more money than I had ever imagined having access to, but somehow it felt less significant than the fact that we had exceeded every expectation our investors had held when they decided to trust us with their money. David Chen was already talking about future projects. Sarah Williams had introduced us to other potential investors who were interested in our approach to community-focused development. Even Robert Kim, who had initially seemed skeptical about our ability to manage something of this scale, was encouraging us to consider larger and more ambitious developments. "There's something else," Marcus continued, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "This came in yesterday's mail, addressed to you personally." The envelope was cream-colored, expensive-looking, with my name written in elegant script across the front. Inside was an invitation to a charity gala hosted by the Chicago Real Estate Development Association, recognizing outstanding achievement in residential construction and community integration. At the bottom, in small print, was a note explaining that the Riverside Commons project had been selected as this year's recipient of the Excellence in Innovation Award. "We're getting an award," I said, staring at the invitation. "We're getting an award." Marcus agreed, grinning. The gala was scheduled for the following Friday evening at one of downtown's most prestigious hotels. I spent the intervening week trying to figure out what someone wore to receive an industry award, eventually settling on a black dress that made me feel both professional and confident. Jennifer insisted on doing my hair, and Marcus rented a tuxedo that made him look like he belonged in a magazine. The ballroom where the ceremony took place was filled with the kind of people I had been watching from a distance for my entire career: established developers, prominent architects, city officials, and business leaders who shaped Chicago's skyline and determined which neighborhoods would thrive or struggle. A year ago, I would have felt intimidated by their presence. Tonight, I felt like I belonged. When they called my name and I walked to the podium to accept the award, I looked out at an audience that included not just industry colleagues but also my parents, Brandon and Ashley, who had surprised me by attending without being invited. My father was sitting in the third row, wearing the kind of proud expression that I had been hoping to see for most of my adult life. This project succeeded because we believed that good development should serve communities, not just investors. I said into the microphone, trying to keep my voice steady. We proved that small companies with big ambitions can create lasting value while building homes that people are proud to live in. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, but what meant more to me was the expression on my father's face as he stood and clapped along with everyone else. For the first time in years, I could see genuine respect in his eyes, and I understood that our relationship would never be quite the same. After the ceremony, Dad found me at the reception, carrying 2 glasses of wine and wearing the kind of awkward smile that suggested he wasn't entirely sure how to begin the conversation he wanted to have. "Congratulations," he said, handing me one of the glasses. "You've accomplished something remarkable." "Thank you," I replied, genuinely meaning it. "I've been thinking about what you said that night at dinner, about building something from nothing, about earning your success rather than inheriting it. I didn't understand it then, but I think I do now." He paused, looking around the ballroom at the celebration happening around us. I want to propose something, he continued. A partnership between Martinez Construction and Martinez Real Estate Investments. Separate companies, separate leadership, but shared resources and complementary expertise. The offer was generous and potentially lucrative, but I found myself hesitating. For 3 years, I had been building something that was entirely my own, making decisions based on my own judgment, succeeding or failing based on my own efforts. The independence had been harder than I had expected, but it had also been more rewarding than I could have imagined. I appreciate the offer, Dad, I said carefully, but I think I want to keep building what we've started. On our own terms, at our own pace. He nodded slowly, and I could see that he wasn't disappointed by my response. If anything, he seemed to approve of it. I understand, he said, and I respect that. But the offer stands whenever you're ready. 6 months later, I was standing in the conference room of our new offices, a space that took up an entire floor of a building in Lincoln Park, and employed 12 people who shared our commitment to community-focused development. We had 3 projects under construction, 2 more in the planning stages, and a reputation that attracted both investors and buyers who wanted to work with developers they could trust. Marcus had been promoted to Vice President of Operations, with his own office and a salary that reflected his contribution to our success. Jennifer had become our official partner, handling marketing and sales for all our developments. Maria had been joined by a full accounting department, and we had hired project managers, architects, and construction supervisors who shared our vision of what good development could accomplish. But the thing I was most proud of wasn't the office or the staff or the impressive project portfolio displayed on our conference room walls. It was the letter I received from Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who lived in one of our Riverside Commons units with her daughter and granddaughter. She wrote to thank us for creating a home where 3 generations of her family could live comfortably together, where her granddaughter could walk to school safely, and where she felt like part of a community rather than just another tenant in an anonymous building. That letter reminded me why we had gotten into this business in the first place, and why success measured purely in financial terms would never be enough. We weren't just building properties or generating returns for investors. We were creating spaces where people could build lives they were proud of, in neighborhoods that supported their hopes and dreams. As I locked up the office that evening and walked to my car, I thought about the journey that had brought me from washing dishes in a strip mall office to receiving industry awards for innovative development work. It had been harder than I had expected, more rewarding than I had imagined, and entirely different from the path my family had originally envisioned for me. Tomorrow I would return to work on projects that mattered, surrounded by people who shared my commitment to building something meaningful and lasting. And somewhere in the city, families were coming home to places we had created with care, attention to detail, and the belief that everyone deserved to live somewhere they could be proud to call home. That was worth more than any award, any recognition, or any amount of money we might earn along the way. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.